cruel cop throws black grandfather off a train platform. Then the conductor stops the whole line. Part 1. The man on the platform. The digital clock above Gate 7 at Harmon Street Station read 2:41 in the afternoon. The sky was the color of old pewter, the kind of February sky that does not promise anything that simply exists above you like a ceiling you cannot touch. Ernest Douglas Whitmore stood near the yellow safety line at the edge of the platform, third position from the north end, which was exactly where he always stood. He had stood in that same position every Wednesday for 11 years. Not because the rules required it, but because Ernest was a man who believed in order, in routine, in the quiet dignity of doing things the same way, until the reasons for doing them became themselves a kind of prayer. He wore a dark wool coat, charcoal gray, with a single button missing from the second position that his daughter Renae had been threatening to replace for 2 winters now. He wore it open at the collar despite the cold, because Ernest Douglas Whitmore had always run warm, had always radiated a kind of internal heat that made winters feel like an inconvenience rather than an assault. His silver hair was cut close and neat. His wire-rimmed glasses, the same style he had worn since 1987, just updated lenses, sat precisely on the bridge of his broad, weathered nose. He was 71 years old, and he carried his height still 6 feet and 1 inch of a man who had once walked 8 miles of postal route before 10 in the morning without complaint, who had shoveled steps and lifted bins and pressed through weather that the television said would make delivery impossible, and he had done it for 38 years, without asking the world to notice. In his left coat pocket, resting against his hip, was his wallet. Inside the wallet, behind his Medicare card and a small photograph of his late wife Dorothy, was his monthly rail pass. It was valid through February 28th. It had been valid without interruption for 11 consecutive years. The train was not yet visible, but he could feel it coming the way he always could. A kind of pressure in the air that arrived a few seconds before the sound did a shift in the atmosphere at the far end of the tunnel that his body had learned to read without thinking. The platform around him held maybe 30 people. A woman in scrubs reading something on her phone. 2 young men in college sweatshirts. A man in a delivery uniform checking a paper list. An older white woman with a rolling cart full of groceries. Regular people going regular places on a regular Wednesday afternoon, each one carrying the full complicated weight of their own ordinary life. Ernest did not know any of their names. He knew Maurice's name. Maurice Aiken, the conductor on the 247 westbound, who had been working this line for 19 years, who would sometimes slide his window open as the train pulled in and exchange 2 or 3 sentences with Ernest about the weather or the Eagles or nothing in particular, conversations that lasted no more than a minute, but that had accumulated over 11 years into something that felt like friendship, or at least the comfortable edges of it. He was thinking about his granddaughter Zoe. She was 6. She had lost her first tooth that Tuesday, and had called him that evening to report the tooth fairy situation with the detailed seriousness of a small scientist presenting findings. She had received $2. She had thoughts about whether this was appropriate compensation. Ernest had listened for 17 minutes and had agreed with everything she said. His grandson Marcus was 9 and was at the age where he tried to appear indifferent to Ernest's arrival, but always ended up sitting next to him on the couch within the first 10 minutes, pressing against his grandfather's arm while pretending to watch something else, as if proximity could be disguised as coincidence. Ernest loved this. He loved it so much it sometimes ached. His daughter Renae taught 3rd grade at a public school in Meadowbrook. She worked until 4:30 on most Wednesdays later, if there were parent conferences. She was 38 years old, and she was raising those 2 children mostly by herself, since her husband David had relocated to Atlanta for work 18 months ago, and the marriage had followed shortly after in the direction of dissolution. Renae did not complain about this. She had gotten her mother's particular kind of stubbornness, the kind that presents itself as composure that gets things done without making a production of the effort. The school let out at 3:15. Ernest's train arrived at Meadowbrook Station at 3:08. It was a 4-minute walk to the school. He had timed it many times not because he was anxious, but because he was a man who believed in knowing his margins. He had first started making this Wednesday trip when Renae went back to work after Marcus was born when Marcus was 4 months old, and Renae had used up her leave and could not afford full-time care on a teacher's salary. Ernest had been retired for 3 years by then, had been spending his Wednesdays the way he spent most of his days, which was to say quietly and without particular direction. He had offered. He had not waited to be asked. 11 years. He had watched Marcus go from infant to boy. He had watched Zoe be born and grow into herself, into this particular fierce, small person with her grandmother's eyes. He had walked them to the park and helped with homework and made them soup when they were sick and read to them until they fell asleep. And he had done all of this every Wednesday, rain or shine or ice or heat, because that was what you did. That was what it meant to be a grandfather. And Ernest Douglas Whitmore took what things meant very seriously. He thought about Dorothy sometimes on the platform. She had died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors had said was fast, and which had felt to Ernest like falling from a very tall building. He still wore his wedding ring. He still set 2 cups in the morning and caught himself at the second cup, sometimes standing in the kitchen in the gray early light with a cup of coffee for no one. And he would stand there for a moment, and then he would drink both cups himself, because he did not like waste, and because Dorothy would have laughed at him for being maudlin about a cup of coffee. She would have loved the train. She had always loved trains, the way the world streamed past the windows, the way you could sit and watch the ordinary world reveal itself in motion. They had taken the Coast Starlight to visit her sister in Seattle the year he retired. They had sat in the observation car and watched the continent open up. He had held her hand the whole way. He thought about this on the platform sometimes. Not with grief exactly, or not only grief, but with the particular tenderness that comes from having been loved well, and having loved well in return from having built a life with another person so thoroughly that their absence reshapes every room you walk into every ordinary Wednesday. Ernest Douglas Whitmore had spent 38 years delivering the mail of a city. He had walked the streets in every season, had knocked on doors and slid letters through slots and known, in the way that postal workers know the rhythms of neighborhoods, the small facts of hundreds of lives. He knew which addresses received birthday cards and which received medical bills. He knew which houses went quiet in winter. He knew the old woman on Clement Street who always came to the door when she heard his footsteps on the porch, not because she was waiting for mail, but because she was waiting for a human being who would confirm that she existed. And Ernest had always stopped, had always said good morning, had always given her 60 seconds of the world. His union had given him a plaque when he retired. His co-workers had given him a cake. The branch supervisor, a woman named Carla, who had worked alongside him for 20 years, had cried, which had surprised everyone, including Carla. Ernest had kept the plaque. He had displayed it for a while and then put it in a closet because it seemed strange to display your own accomplishments in your own living room. He did not think of himself as a man who had done remarkable things. He thought of himself as a man who had done his job, who had been present, who had kept his word. He had been a good husband. He had tried to be a good father. He was working every Wednesday at being the best grandfather he knew how to be. There were neighborhoods he had memorized the way musicians memorize scales, not consciously, not deliberately, but through repetition, until the knowledge lived in the body rather than the mind. He knew which yards had dogs. He knew which front steps were icy before the owners did. He knew which family had a new baby by the way the lights came on at 2 in the morning. Postal work was intimate in ways that no job description could capture. You were the only outsider who visited every home. You saw the shapes of lives from the outside, the party invitations and the tax notices, the love letters and the foreclosure warnings. Ernest had carried all of it with the same equanimity, had delivered bad news and good news in the same leather satchel, and he had understood this as a form of trust. The city trusted him with its mail. He had not once in 38 years given it reason to revoke that trust. His co-workers had known him as a man who was never late and never loud, and never brought his troubles to the root. But they had also known those who paid attention that he was the one you came to when something was wrong, when a shift was impossible to cover, or a new carrier was struggling, or someone in the branch was being treated unfairly. Not because Ernest was political, because he was reliable, and because his fairness was not in dispute. People of all kinds trusted his judgment. He had been asked 3 times to move into management. He had declined 3 times because he believed in the work of the route, and because he had seen what happened to good men when they were asked to manage the gap between what the institution said it valued and what it actually did. Dorothy had understood this about him from the beginning. She had understood when she married him that she was not marrying a man who would become something else. She was marrying the man who was already in front of her, steady, deliberate, committed to the particular over the grand. She had never wanted the grand. She had wanted exactly what they had built together, which was a life that was full in every dimension that counted, that was rich in the specific and the particular and the daily, even when the daily was difficult, even when the daily was grief. They had met at a church social in 1975. She had been wearing a yellow dress. He had not spoken to her for 45 minutes because he had spent those 45 minutes trying to think of something worth saying to a woman in a yellow dress who had a laugh that reorganized the room she was in. When he finally spoke to her, it was to say something obvious about the food which she had received with enough generosity that he had been encouraged to continue. They had talked for 2 hours. He had driven her home. He had come back the next Sunday, even though he attended a different church. They had been married for 41 years before the diagnosis. In those 41 years, they had not been without conflict, had not been without the ordinary abrasions of 2 strong-willed people in close quarters, had not been without the seasons every marriage passes through. But they had also not been without this, the certainty which deepened over the decades, rather than wearing down, that they had chosen correctly, that the choosing had been the best thing either of them had ever done. After she died, Ernest had continued the Wednesdays not only for Renae and the children, but because the Wednesdays gave structure to a grief that would otherwise have had none. Grief without structure becomes a current you cannot navigate. Ernest had learned this. The Wednesdays were his anchor. The train was his anchor. The rail pass in his wallet was an act of faith renewed at the beginning of every month. The faith that the world would continue to contain things worth showing up for, that there would be school doors opening at 3:15, that his name would come flying across a courtyard in a small, clear voice. The pressure in the air changed. The sound arrived a low building rush from the tunnel mouth. The people on the platform gathered themselves in the small ways that people do, shifting weight, pocketing phones, reaching for bags. Ernest straightened slightly, not from nervousness, but from habit, from 38 years of presenting himself to the world as a man who was ready. He was thinking about Zoe's tooth. He was thinking about the $2 deliberation. He was thinking about what he would make for dinner, whether Renae would have energy for conversation when she got home, or whether she would need the house to be quiet. He was planning in the gentle and detailed way that he planned everything the next 4 hours of his life. He did not see Officer Craig Pellegrino until Pellegrino was already beside him. Part 2. First Contact. He was a young man. That was the first thing Ernest noticed. Young and broad, with the particular kind of physical confidence that can come either from discipline or from certainty about the power you carry. And Ernest had learned over 71 years to pay attention to the difference. Pellegrino was 34, though he looked younger in the way that men who have never been made to feel doubt can look younger, as though uncertainty ages a person, and its absence preserves something that should perhaps not be preserved. He wore the Transit Authority uniform with the fluorescent safety vest over it, and he had his hands on his belt in the way that indicated he was very conscious of his hands on his belt. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your pass." Ernest turned. He looked at the officer for a moment the way Ernest looked at most things, steadily and without hurry. "Of course," Ernest said. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved his wallet. He opened it. He removed the monthly rail pass, a standard laminated card with the Transit Authority logo and his name printed on it, and the validity dates printed clearly in black ink, February 1st through February 28th. He held it out. Pellegrino took it. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than looking at it required. "When did you get this?" "First of the month," Ernest said. "I renew at the beginning of every month. Have for 11 years. "This doesn't look right." Ernest felt something move through him. Not anger. Not yet. Something more like recognition, a cellular awareness of a pattern he had encountered before, had hoped to encounter less of. As the years went on, had watched the world allegedly make progress on. And yet, here it was again, in its familiar shape, wearing its familiar face. "It is right," Ernest said. His voice was even. He had a deep voice, a measured voice, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning to speak in a way that could not be mischaracterized. "It's a valid monthly pass. My name is on it. You can verify it with your scanner if you have one." "I don't need a scanner to tell me something looks off." "With respect," Ernest said, "I think a scanner is exactly the appropriate way to verify a pass. That's what they're for." Pellegrino looked at him. Something shifted in the younger man's expression. Something that had nothing to do with the pass, nothing to do with validity or procedure. It was the shift of a man who has been answered when he expected silence, who has encountered pushback when he expected deference. "Where'd you get it?" "At the window," Ernest said. "Station window, Harmon Street Station. 1st of February. I purchased them in person. I have done so every month for 11 years. "You have a receipt." "I don't typically keep a monthly receipt for a recurring purchase," Ernest said. "I have the pass itself, which is what the Transit Authority issues as proof of valid fare. If there's a question about its validity, I'd appreciate you scanning it or contacting your supervisor. My train arrives in approximately 5 minutes, and I need to board it." "Your train's not going anywhere until I clear this." Ernest looked at the officer. He was still calm. He was very deliberately still calm. He understood with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of experience that calm was his best protection in this moment, and his best weapon such as it was. He understood that any agitation on his part would be used against him, would become the story, would erase the injustice and replace it with the justification. He had known this since he was young. He had been taught it by his father, who had been taught it by his father, this specific knowledge of how to be a black man in America in a confrontation with authority, this exhausting, essential, heartbreaking knowledge. "I am asking," Ernest said, "to speak with your supervisor. I am the authority on this platform right now." "I understand that," Ernest said, "and I'm not disputing your authority. I am requesting, as is my right, to speak with your supervisor about a dispute over a valid fare document. That's a reasonable request, and I'd like it honored." "Your request is noted." "My request is not noted," Ernest said. "My request is to actually speak with a supervisor. Noting it is not the same thing." Something crossed Pellegrino's face. It was quick, a compression of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. Ernest had seen that expression before. It was the expression of someone who has decided that a situation is now personal. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the boarding area." "I am waiting for my train," Ernest said. "Step back from the boarding area." The woman with the rolling cart was watching. The 2 young men in college sweatshirts were watching. The woman in scrubs had looked up from her phone. The platform had the particular charged quality of a space where something wrong is happening and everyone present knows it, but no one is sure what to do about it. That specific social paralysis that comes from the presence of a uniform and the uncertainty about authority. Ernest stood still. He was making a choice. He was making it consciously and with full awareness of what it might cost him. He thought about the school bell. He thought about 3:15. "I have a valid pass," Ernest said. "I have ridden this train every Wednesday for 11 years. I am entitled to board." "Last warning," Pellegrino said. "Step back." Ernest looked at him. He looked at this young man with his hands on his belt, and his certainty and his authority, and something in Ernest's chest pulled tight, not with fear, but with a sorrow that was old and familiar. A sorrow that had been there since long before Ernest was old enough to understand it, that lived in his body the way the cold lived in old joints. He thought about his father, who had been a porter for the railroad for 30 years, who had known every sleeping car, and every dining car, and every white man who walked past him without seeing him, who had come home every night and sat at the dinner table and said grace before every meal, and never said a word about it to his children, because there were things you did not give to your children, things you absorbed so they did not have to. He thought about this. He thought about the weight of it. And Ernest Douglas Whitmore did not step back. Part 3. Escalation. The train was not yet visible in the tunnel, but the sound was building. Now the approaching pressure of something large and heavy and certain coming through the dark toward them. Ernest could feel it in his feet through the platform concrete. He stood at the yellow line in his open charcoal coat and his wire-rimmed glasses, and he did not move. The passengers on the platform had arranged themselves into a kind of silent audience. The 2 college boys had put away their phones. The woman in scrubs had taken 2 small steps sideways, not away from the confrontation, but toward it, drawn by the gravity of something that felt wrong, in the way that only genuinely wrong things feel. The woman with the rolling cart had gone completely still. Pellegrino stepped closer. "Sir, if you do not comply, I will remove you from this boarding area." "You do not have cause to remove me," Ernest said. He was still speaking in his measured voice, still keeping the register low and clear. "I have a valid fare document. I have committed no violation. I am standing on a public transit platform in my legal right to board. I am asking you once more to call your supervisor or to scan my pass." "I've already made a determination about your pass." "On what basis?" "On the basis of my professional judgment." Ernest let that sit for a moment. Around them, the platform was very quiet except for the growing sound of the train. "Your professional judgment," Ernest said, "is not a scanner. It is not procedure. And I am telling you clearly that this pass is valid, that I am a monthly pass holder of 11 years standing, and that I intend to board this train." "Your intention doesn't matter." "It matters to my grandchildren," Ernest said, and then because he was not a man given to private disclosure and public confrontations, but because something about the moment demanded it, demanded that this officer understand what he was actually doing, he continued. "I pick them up from school every Wednesday. The school lets out at 3:15. I need to be on this train." Pellegrino did not respond to this. That was its own answer. The thing about Officer Craig Pellegrino, that his service record, his 2 prior excessive force complaints, his evaluations, his colleagues' quiet observations could not fully capture, was the particular quality of his certainty. He had become a transit officer at 26, and had operated from his first day on the conviction that authority was a one-directional thing, that it flowed from the uniform outward, that any response other than compliance was a form of disrespect, and that disrespect was itself a form of threat. He was not in the way that movie villains are bad, cartoonishly bad. He was bad in the more common and more dangerous way, which is to say that he had never been required to question himself, had never encountered a consequence that recalibrated his understanding of his own behavior, had never had a supervisor sit him down and say, "The way you do this is wrong." The 2 prior complaints had been investigated. The word investigated was doing significant work in that sentence. They had been reviewed. They had been filed. They had been closed. Pellegrino had received in each case a conversation rather than a consequence, and he had emerged from those conversations with the conviction that he had been correct, that the complainants had been difficult, that the system had understood and agreed with him. He looked at Ernest now, and he saw a man who would not move, which registered in his understanding not as principle, but as defiance. He could not distinguish between them. That inability was not a character flaw so much as a structural failure, a failure of training and supervision and accountability. but the effect of it was the same as a 71-year-old man on a platform where he had every right to stand. "This is your last opportunity," Pellegrino said. "Step back or I will escort you off this boarding area." Ernest looked at him for a long moment. The other passengers were watching. This was important. Not because their watching changed the physics of what was happening, but because witnesses change the meaning of things, and Ernest knew this, and he wanted them to see clearly. He was not making a scene. He was not being aggressive. He was standing still in a coat with a missing button, holding his wallet in one hand, 71 years old and unbowed. "You are making a mistake," Ernest said. "I want you to know that I understand that, and I want you to know that it is not too late to correct it." This was the wrong thing to say in the sense that it was not what Pellegrino wanted to hear. It was the exactly right thing to say in every other sense. Pellegrino moved. He put his hand on Ernest's arm. His grip was firm, professional in the technical sense of the word, the kind of grip that transit authority training taught for managing non-compliant individuals, a grip that is designed to move a body without explicitly appearing to be force. Ernest felt it, and he did not flinch. He did not resist. He was a man who had decided before the first word was spoken that he would not give this officer anything that could be used against him, and so he let himself be moved, let his feet find the ground as Pellegrino walked him backward away from the yellow line, away from the boarding area toward the far edge of the platform near the shelter wall. He heard the woman with the cart say something. He could not hear the words. He heard one of the college boys say something louder, and Pellegrino turned briefly toward him and said, "This is a transit authority matter, step back." And the college boy stepped back. Ernest found himself against the shelter wall. Pellegrino released his arm. He took up a position between Ernest and the boarding area, feet apart, hands back on his belt. "Stay here," Pellegrino said. Ernest looked past him. The train was emerging from the tunnel, now the headlights white and wide in the gray afternoon, the sound of it filling the platform, the air moving. He looked at the train and he thought about 3:15. He had walked a postal route through a snowstorm in 1993 that had closed schools and shut down half the city. He had delivered mail that day to 847 addresses because the mail had to be delivered, because that was his commitment, and he honored it. He had come home that evening, and Dorothy had made him stand by the radiator for 20 minutes before she let him sit down. She had made soup. She had rolled her eyes at him with the fond exasperation of a woman who loved a man who took his commitments more seriously than his own comfort. He thought about that soup. He thought about the radiator. He thought about how she had looked at him, that particular look. He thought about Zoe losing her tooth. He thought about Marcus pressing against his arm, pretending not to care. He was being told he did not belong here. He was being told by the physical fact of where he now stood removed from the platform by a man with a badge that he was not a legitimate passenger on this train he had ridden for 11 years. He was being told this without any of those words being spoken because the words did not need to be spoken. The act said everything that words would have said. What it meant to be a black man of Ernest's generation standing on a platform and being told he did not belong was not something that existed in the moment only. It existed in accumulated moments, in the layered sediment of a lifetime of encounters with exactly this kind of certainty, from exactly this kind of person. This certainty that he was a problem to be managed rather than a man to be spoken with. He had been a teenager when he first learned this. He had learned it in the way black boys in America learn it not from a textbook, but from a body memory, from the specific way the air changes when certain people look at you with certain eyes. He had hoped. He had always hoped. He had voted and worked and paid his taxes and served his community and raised his daughter to be excellent and watched his grandchildren grow and kept hoping that the distance between the world as it was and the world as it should be was getting smaller. And perhaps it was. But on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in February, it was not small enough to matter to Ernest Douglas Whitmore standing against a shelter wall, watching his train arrive without him. He reached into his pocket. He found his phone. He thought about calling Renae. He thought about what he would say. He could not think of how to explain this to her in a way that would not terrify her and enrage her and add to the weight she already carried. He put the phone back. He watched the train come to a stop. He watched the doors not open. Part 4. Isolation and the breaking point. The platform went through a change when the train stopped and the doors did not open. It was a small change at first, the kind of thing you register before you understand it. A collective pause in the 30 people gathered at the boarding positions, a half-second of held breath before the understanding arrived that something unusual was happening. The train sat on the tracks with its engine humming and its lights burning and its doors sealed, and no one on the platform moved, and the silence of those doors was very loud. Ernest stood against the shelter wall, and he felt something in his chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear. He did not know yet. He had no way to know. He only knew that the doors had not opened, and that in his 11 years of riding this train the doors had always opened. Pellegrino turned to look at the train. His hands dropped from his belt. He had the posture of a man whose script has just gone off. Ernest looked at the train. He looked at the cab at the front, the conductor's position, and he could see the window. He could see a figure in the window. He could see even at this distance that the figure in the window was watching the platform. He knew that posture. He had seen that posture through that window dozens of times over 11 years. Maurice. But he did not let himself assume. He waited. He had learned in 7 decades of living that hoping too quickly can make the fall longer. He stood against the shelter wall. He was 60 feet from the boarding area. The cold was in his feet now in the way the cold gets into feet that have been standing on concrete for 20 minutes, a slow, creeping numbness that travels upward. He shifted his weight, a small and private acknowledgement of his age, of the fact that his body registered these things in ways it had not when he was younger. He thought about Zoe. He thought about the specific way she pronounced his name, not Grandpa or Granddad or Pop, but Ernest, his actual name, which she had started using at age 4 for reasons that no one had ever been able to explain, but which had delighted everyone, including Ernest, who found it both absurd and deeply moving to have a 4-year-old address him by his full first name with complete seriousness. Ernest. She said it like it was a word she owned. He thought about Marcus at 9, who was reading above his grade level and who had recently become interested in astronomy in the focused and consuming way that 9-year-olds become interested in things, and who had explained to Ernest the difference between a waxing and a waning moon with the patient precision of a small professor. Ernest had listened with complete attention because the complete attention of a grandparent is one of the rarest and most nourishing things in the world. And he knew it, and he gave it deliberately. He thought about Renae. He thought about how she had looked the first Wednesday he had made this trip when Marcus was 4 months old and she was returning to work and had cried in the car on the way home from dropping the baby with Ernest. Not from sadness exactly, but from the complex and overwhelming emotion of being a person who loves people and has too little time and too many demands and insufficient margin for any of it to go wrong. He was her margin. Every Wednesday. He was the thing that made it possible for her to be a good teacher and a good mother and a whole person with a salary and a future. He was the backup plan. He was the infrastructure. And he was standing against a shelter wall on a February platform with a missing button on his coat and a valid rail pass in his wallet being held in place by a young officer who had decided for reasons that had nothing to do with the pass that Ernest Douglas Whitmore was a problem. The specific horror of it was not the injustice in the abstract. The specific horror was the practical consequence of the injustice. If he did not get on this train, Renae would get a phone call at 3:15 from the school. There was no one else. There was no grandmother, no neighbor on standby, no other plan. Renae would have to leave her classroom in the middle of the afternoon and drive across town. She would arrive at the school flustered and frightened, and she would have to explain to Marcus and Zoe, who would have been waiting in the office, that something had happened. Something had gone wrong. Ernest was not there. Ernest was always there. He had been there for 11 years. He had been there in rain and snow and the brutal, humid weight of August. He had been there with a head cold that made his sinuses feel like they were packed with sand. He had been there the Wednesday after Dorothy's funeral, 6 days after they buried her because Renae needed him, and because Dorothy would have expected no less, and because being needed was in his experience one of the better remedies for grief. He was 71 years old. He had spent his life in service. Service to the postal system, service to his family, service to the slow accumulation of trust that builds between a person and the people who depend on him. And he was standing against a wall being told he was not legitimate, that his documents were not real, that his 11 years of presence on this platform were not sufficient to establish that he had a right to be here. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from this. From having to prove yourself in rooms and on platforms and in moments where you should not have to prove yourself. From having to be twice as careful, twice as calm, twice as correct, just to receive the ordinary treatment that other people receive as default. Ernest had carried this exhaustion for most of his adult life. It had become such a constant presence that he barely noticed it on most days. It lived in him the way an old injury lives in a body dormant until the weather changes and then suddenly present, suddenly very loud. On this platform on this Wednesday afternoon, the weather had changed. He looked at the train. He looked at the cab window. He looked at the figure there. He stood up straighter. Not a performance, not a defiance. Something more instinctive than either of those things, something that came from deeper than strategy. The refusal, even now, to let himself be diminished in his own body's language, to let the weight of this moment press him into a shape that was less than himself. He was Ernest Douglas Whitmore. He had walked 8 miles in a snowstorm to deliver the mail. He had held his wife's hand while she died. He was the man who listened to his granddaughter talk about tooth fairy compensation for 17 minutes and agreed with every point she made. He was not going to disappear just because someone had told him to. He had made that choice many times over the course of his life. Not always on platforms, not always in public. Sometimes in the quiet insistence of a complaint filed with the postal service about a route change that disproportionately affected certain carriers. Sometimes in the formal and carefully worded note he had left in the suggestions box at his branch, a note no one had ever directly acknowledged but which had produced 6 weeks later a change in break room policy that affected 15 people. Sometimes in the refusal when he was 23 years old and knew on the route to take a different path through a neighborhood, because a supervisor had suggested, with a vagueness that was itself a kind of message, that it might be easier for everyone. He had not taken the different path. He had taken the route he was assigned. He had done his job. These were the small resistances that do not make it into any record that no one writes about, that accumulate over a lifetime into the substance of a person's character without ever announcing themselves as character forming. Ernest had not thought of them at the time as courage. He had thought of them as accuracy. He had been accurate about what was right. He had done the right thing. That was not heroism. That was just living with precision. The cold was in his feet. The platform was still. The train sat humming on the tracks, 30 feet in front of him. Its doors sealed its engine running, waiting for something that had not yet resolved itself. Ernest stood straight. He breathed. He watched the cab window. He waited. Part 5. The Conductor's Window. Maurice Aiken had been pulling into Harmon Street Station for 19 years. He knew this platform the way you know a place you have arrived at hundreds of times. The way familiarity becomes a kind of second vision, so that you see not just what is there, but all the previous times it has been there. All the accumulated versions of this particular place overlaid on top of each other. He knew the angle of the afternoon light at this time of year, the way it came flat and gray through the open end of the station. He knew the position of the clock above Gate 7. He knew the particular acoustic of this platform, the way the train's approach sounded differently here than it did at any other station on the line. He knew the spot near the north end where Ernest Whitmore always stood. He had seen Ernest there so many times that Ernest's absence from that spot would have registered as unusual in the way that a familiar landmark looks wrong when it is moved. When Maurice's train pulled into Harmon Street on a Wednesday, some part of his awareness always noted in passing, there is Ernest Third from the North End in whatever coat he is wearing that season. Today, as the train came out of the tunnel and the platform resolved into its specific Wednesday afternoon configuration of 30-odd people, Maurice looked to the North End. He looked to the third position. Ernest was not there. Maurice scanned the platform. He was trained to monitor the platform as he pulled in. 19 years had made this monitoring second nature and automatic processing of what he saw. He processed what he saw, and what he saw was wrong. Ernest was against the shelter wall, not at the boarding area, not in his third position. Against the wall, 60 feet back and between him and the boarding area, stood a transit officer in a fluorescent vest. Maurice did not know Pellegrino by name, but he knew that configuration. He had worked this system for 19 years. He knew what it looked like when a transit officer had detained someone on a platform. He felt something move through him. A stillness that was also a decision, a particular kind of clarity that comes when you see something clearly enough that the question of what to do with what you have seen resolves itself almost before you have fully articulated the question. He stopped the train. He stopped it the way you stop a train. He brought it to its halt at the platform position. He did not open the doors. This was not technically within standard operating procedure. The doors should open within seconds of the train stopping. Passengers waiting. He had seconds before anyone would notice, before anyone would call on the radio, before the delay would register as a delay. He had seconds to decide. He had already decided. Maurice Aiken was 54 years old. He had grown up in a row house in North Philadelphia with his parents and 2 sisters. His father had worked at the water department for 30 years. His mother had worked school cafeteria. They had not been wealthy. They had been stable, which was a different thing, and in some ways a harder thing to achieve, and they had taught him the difference between the two, and why stability was what you built on what you passed down. He had been a transit conductor because he had liked trains and he had liked people, and it had been a union job with benefits, and 19 years in, he still liked trains and still liked people and had no regrets about any of it. He knew this line. He knew this line the way a man knows a route he has traveled thousands of times, the stations and the curves and the particular light at every time of day. He knew Ernest Whitmore, not deeply. Not in the way you know a friend you see outside of a context. But he knew him in the way that accumulates over years of brief weekly exchanges, the kind of knowing that is specific and warm, even if it is narrow. He knew that Ernest had grandchildren in Meadowbrook. He knew that Ernest had ridden this train every Wednesday for as long as Maurice had been working the Wednesday schedule. He had seen Ernest's rail pass more times than he could count, had seen him retrieve it from his wallet with the same practiced efficiency every single time, had never once seen it be anything other than valid and current and real. He sat in the cab and he looked at the platform. He looked at Ernest against the wall. He looked at the officer standing between Ernest and the train. He picked up his radio. He called the platform supervisor's line. He said, "I have a situation at Harmon Street Station. I need a supervisor at the platform. I am holding the train." He said it calmly. He said it the way a man who has been working a job for 19 years says a thing without drama as a statement of fact. Then he got up. He went to the door. He opened it. He stepped down onto the platform. The 30-odd people on the platform watched him do this. There was a quality to what happened next that everyone who was there would later describe differently in the specific details, but identically in the feeling. The sense that the air changed, that the stakes became suddenly visible, that something that had been happening in the middle distance was now happening in the center of the room. Maurice was not a tall man. He was medium height, solid, with close-cropped hair that had gone mostly gray in the last few years, and a face that people generally described as kind, which he would have said was just what a face looks like when a person has learned not to waste energy on hostility. He wore his conductor's uniform, the dark jacket, and the hat that he had never gotten over, feeling slightly self-conscious about the hat being the one part of the uniform that always made him feel like he was playing a role in an old movie. He walked toward Pellegrino. He walked in the unhurried way of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has no uncertainty about whether he should be going there. He stopped in front of Pellegrino. He looked at him, then he looked past him at Ernest. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Are you all right?" Ernest looked at him. Something shifted in Ernest's face. Something that had been very carefully held, very carefully controlled for the last 20 minutes. And for a moment he did not speak. "I am," Ernest said. "Thank you, Maurice." Pellegrino turned to Maurice. "Sir, I'm going to need you to get back on your train. This is a transit authority matter." Maurice looked at him. "I am a transit authority employee," he said. 19 years. And this man has a valid pass. "That's my determination to make." "It's your determination to make with a scanner," Maurice said, "or with a supervisor. It is not your determination to make by telling a man to stand against a wall. I have seen Mr. Whitmore's pass every Wednesday for years. I know it is valid. You can't speak to the validity of a fare document from a conductor's window." "I can speak to having seen a man present a valid monthly pass every single Wednesday for a decade," Maurice said. "I can speak to knowing this man by name and knowing he is a monthly pass holder. And I can tell you that this train does not move until he boards." Pellegrino looked at him. "You are interfering with a transit authority action." "I have called the platform supervisor," Maurice said. "They are on their way. We will wait." He turned and looked at Ernest. He made a small gesture with his head, an invitation, not a command. Ernest walked forward. He walked past Pellegrino, who did not stop him. Perhaps because the conductor was there. Perhaps because the 30 people on the platform were watching with 30 pairs of eyes, and every one of them was recording this on a phone. Perhaps because some calculation somewhere in Pellegrino's processing registered that the specific weight of this moment had shifted in a direction that was no longer in his favor. Ernest walked to the boarding position. He stood at the yellow line. He stood third from the north end in his spot as he had stood for 11 years. No one on the platform spoke. The air held. The train hummed on the tracks. Maurice stood where he had stopped, equidistant between Pellegrino and the boarding area, and waited. 4 minutes. The platform supervisor, a woman named DeAnna Brooks, arrived from the station interior at something close to a run, which was not how DeAnna Brooks typically moved because she had been a platform supervisor for 12 years and had seen most things. But the radio call from the conductor holding a train was not a thing she had encountered before. She assessed the situation in about 15 seconds. The conductor on the platform, the officer in the vest, the passengers, the man at the boarding position. She spoke briefly with Pellegrino. The conversation was quiet. Ernest could not hear it. He did not need to. DeAnna Brooks turned to Ernest. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. Please board when you're ready." Ernest nodded. He looked at Pellegrino once more, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the patient and steady gaze of a man who had said what he said, and stood where he stood, and turned out to be right about all of it. He turned to Maurice. Maurice gave him the smallest nod, the kind of nod that doesn't need anything attached to it, that has been stripped down to its essential meaning. "I see you. You are right to be here. Go." Ernest boarded the train. Maurice followed him. He walked back through the car to the cab. He closed the door. He got on the radio. He said the train was cleared to proceed. The doors opened for the other passengers. The platform resumed its movement, people boarding with the quick efficiency of commuters who have been waiting, folding themselves into the cars with their bags and their phones and their ordinary Wednesdays. The train began to move. Ernest found a seat. He sat down. He put his wallet back in his pocket. He looked out the window at the platform going past, at the gray February sky, at the city moving alongside him. He took a breath that was longer and slower than his usual breaths, the breath of a man allowing himself to decompress from something he had held very tightly for 20 minutes. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, but something in him was very near the edge of something, and he sat with that for a moment with the nearness of it before he steadied himself and let the train carry him west. He arrived at Meadowbrook Station at 3:11. It was a 4-minute walk to the school. He walked it at his usual pace. The school doors opened at 3:15. He was there. Part 6. What Remains. The formal complaint was filed the following Monday. Ernest did not file it in anger. He filed it in the careful and deliberate way he did most things, sitting at his kitchen table with a legal pad and taking 2 days to organize his thoughts before he typed them into a document that was 3.5 pages long, single-spaced, written in a prose style that was clear and specific and free of the kind of emotion that gives people an excuse to dismiss the content. He named the date. He named the officer. He described what had happened in order from the moment the officer approached him to the moment he boarded the train. He described his rail pass and its validity. He described the request for a supervisor and the denial of that request. He described the physical removal from the boarding area. He had 2 witnesses who had given him their contact information on the train, the woman in the scrubs, whose name was Daphne Okafor, and who was a registered nurse at St. Clement's, and one of the college boys whose name was Terrence Williams, and who was a junior at the State University. Both of them had recorded portions of what happened on their phones. He also included in the formal complaint a description of the conductor's intervention. He described Maurice Aiken's actions in detail and stated explicitly that they were the reason he had made his train. He asked that the transit authority acknowledge what Maurice had done. He sent copies to the Transit Authority's Customer Service Office, its Oversight Board, and its Director of Operations. He was not certain any of them would read it. He sent it anyway because doing nothing was also a choice, and Ernest did not make that choice. What happened after that moved with a speed that surprised him, though perhaps it should not have, given that there were phone recordings and a conductor's formal statement and a platform supervisor who had been present. The Transit Authority opened an investigation within the week. Officer Craig Pellegrino was placed on administrative assignment, which was not the same as suspension, but moved him off platform duty while the investigation proceeded. His prior complaints were pulled and reviewed by the Oversight Office. 2 incidents that had previously been reviewed and closed, but that now in the context of a 3rd documented incident looked different. They looked like a pattern. The word pattern appeared in the investigative findings. At the end of the investigation, Pellegrino received a formal written reprimand, mandatory retraining, and a 60-day period of supervised duty. Whether this was sufficient was a question that many people answered differently, and that did not have a clean answer, because these questions rarely do. Ernest thought about it. He thought it was not sufficient in the way that most consequences are not sufficient, that the gap between what happens to people who misuse authority and what should happen to people who misuse authority is one of the durable unfairnesses of the world. He filed the document away. He did not spend energy on it beyond that. Maurice Aiken received a formal commendation from the Transit Authority, presented at a small ceremony in the Transit Authority's headquarters that Maurice attended in his conductor's uniform and hat, and that he described to his wife afterward as embarrassing but nice. His supervisor gave a brief speech. The Director of Operations shook his hand. There was a photograph that ran in the Transit Authority's internal newsletter and then unexpectedly in the local paper because someone shared it online, and it traveled in the particular way that stories about people doing right things can travel, with a kind of speed and warmth that suggests people are relieved to see it or hungry for it. Maurice did not think of what he had done as heroic. He thought of it as obvious. He said this to the reporter who called him in almost exactly those words. "I knew that man. I knew his pass was valid. The train wasn't moving until he boarded. That's not heroism, that's just how things ought to work." Ernest's letter to the Transit Authority was separate from his formal complaint. He wrote it after the complaint was filed, after the investigation had begun, after the outcome was known. He addressed it to the Director of Operations, and he wrote it by hand first on the legal pad, and then typed it. It was 2 pages. It began not with grievance, but with history. He told them about his first Wednesday on the commuter rail 11 years ago when Marcus was 4 months old and Renae was going back to work, and he was a recently retired postal worker with more time than structure and the absolute willingness to be useful. He told them what the train represented to him, not just transportation, but continuity, the reliable mechanism by which he kept his word to his daughter every week. He told them what it had meant over 11 years to be a regular on this line, to be known by the conductor, to have that small, ordinary familiarity. He told them what it had meant to stand on that platform and be told he did not belong there. He did not use accusatory language. He did not use the kind of language that could be dismissed as inflammatory. He used precise, measured language that was by its precision and its restraint more devastating than anger would have been. He described what it means to be 71 years old, and to have spent your life in service, and to be told by a man with a badge that your documents are not real, that your presence is not legitimate, that you need to step back and stay there. He told them about his grandchildren. He told them about 315. He told them he made it. He told them that Maurice Aiken had been the reason he made it, and that he wanted them to know this explicitly, to have it in writing. From him, from the person most affected, that Maurice Aiken had done the right thing, and that the right thing had cost him something, a delay on a line with schedules, a confrontation with a colleague, a step off the train into a cold February afternoon to stand between an injustice and its outcome, and that Ernest was grateful for this in a way that did not have an adequate word. He closed the letter by saying that he hoped the transit authority would look carefully at what had happened on that platform, not as an isolated incident, but as an example of something that its passengers needed it to understand, that the people who rode its trains were not problems to be managed. They were human beings with lives and purposes and grandchildren and valid rail passes and 11 years of trust that they had placed in a public system. That trust was worth protecting. It was, in fact, the only thing that made public transit work. He signed it Ernest Douglas Whitmore monthly pass holder, 11 years. The following Wednesday, he arrived at Harmon Street Station at his usual time, 2:38 in the afternoon, and walked to Gate 7. There were 6 people waiting for him. He did not immediately understand this. The woman in scrubs, Daphne Okafor, was there. Terrence Williams, the college student, was there. The woman with the rolling cart was there. And 3 others, a man in a work jacket, who Ernest did not recognize, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, who he also did not recognize, and a young woman who could not have been more than 25. 6 people, none of them in his third position near the north end. All of them arranged just behind it as if they were holding space. They greeted him when he came through the gate. Not with applause, not with anything embarrassing, just with his name. Daphne said, "Mr. Whitmore, good to see you." Terrence raised a hand. The woman with the rolling cart gave him a nod of the particular variety that communicates a great deal with very little movement. The man in the work jacket said, "Ernest," simply and warmly, as if they had known each other for years. Ernest stood for a moment. He was surprised. He did not embarrass easily, but he was in this moment moved in a way that he had to work to contain. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because the platform was public, and he was still at 71 a man who kept his interior life as his own. "Thank you," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he believed in saying true things, "This means a great deal." He took his position. Third from the north end. He stood there, and the others stood near him, and they waited for the train in the particular companionable silence of people who are on the same side of something. The train came. The doors opened. Maurice's window was open, which it did not need to be in February, which meant he had opened it deliberately. He looked at Ernest. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Maurice. Cold one today." "It is?" Ernest agreed. Maurice slid the window closed. Ernest boarded. What Maurice Aiken's act meant in the context of this city. This line, this community's relationship to the transit system it depended on, was something that would take time to fully resolve itself into words. It was in the newspaper. It was in the transit authority's newsletter. It was in the formal commendation. But those were the articulate parts of it, the parts that had been translated into language and record. The inarticulate part was larger. It was in the 6 people standing at Gate 7 the following Wednesday. It was in the particular feeling, familiar and too often unavailable, that a public system had done what a public system is supposed to do, had worked on behalf of the person it was supposed to work for. That Morris had not just followed procedure, but had understood that procedure exists to serve something larger than procedure. That the train is not the point, that the people on the train are the point. That a 71-year-old man with a valid pass and 2 grandchildren waiting for him at a school in Meadowbrook was always the point, had always been the point. There is a kind of faith that ordinary people place in public systems, not naive faith, not the faith of someone who has never been disappointed. The faith of someone who knows the system is imperfect and knows it has failed people and continues anyway, boards the train anyway, buys the monthly pass anyway, because the alternative is to stop believing that the systems built to serve everyone can be made to actually serve everyone, and that belief, however battered, is worth maintaining. Ernest Douglas Whitmore had maintained it. He had maintained it standing against a shelter wall in a charcoal coat. He had maintained it by not stepping back. He had maintained it by requesting a supervisor, by stating clearly and calmly that he was right, by refusing to be diminished in his own body's language, even when the world was trying very hard to diminish him. And Maurice Aiken had stepped off his train. That was what this was. Not more complicated than that. A man who knew what was right and had the ability in that moment to do it, and did it. He had stopped the whole line. He had stepped out into the cold February afternoon. He had said this train does not move until he boards. People talk sometimes about bystander behavior, about the conditions under which witnesses to injustice intervene. The research is complicated, and the conclusions are partial. And the truth is that most of us in most moments do not know what we would do until we are in the moment. Maurice Aiken had been in the moment. He had done what the research says most people do not do. He had gotten off the train. He had done it because he knew Ernest's name. He had done it because 19 years of brief Wednesday conversations had given him something that theory and principle alone might not have given him the specific weight of this specific person's specific life. He had done it because Ernest Whitmore was not an abstraction of an unjust situation. He was a man Maurice Aiken knew, whose granddaughter's name he did not know, but whose existence he knew, about whose Wednesday purpose he understood, whose monthly pass he had seen enough times to know with certainty that what was happening on the platform was wrong. This is what relationships do, even small ones, even the brief quarterly kind that consists of 2 or 3 sentences through a conductor's window. They make people real to each other. They make it harder to look away. Ernest arrived at Meadowbrook Station at 3:09. He had a 3-minute margin. He walked the 4 minutes at his usual pace, which was neither slow nor rushed, which was the pace of a man who knows where he is going and trusts his body to get him there. The school was a 2-story brick building with a painted mural on the south wall that the 3rd graders had done 2 years ago, primary colors and handprints, and the words, "This is our community." Ernest had always liked that mural. He stood outside the main door at 3:14 and watched the second hand on his watch and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury, the simple occupation of a moment without wait. At 3:15 the doors opened. Children came out in the particular controlled surge that happens when institutional doors open for children, a wave of backpacks and noise and specific faces. Renae's children's teacher came out with the kindergarten line, and there at the end of it, in a red coat with her hair in 2 braids and her backpack almost as big as she was Zoe. She spotted him immediately. She spotted him the way she always spotted him, with her whole face. Everything rearranging itself into something that was without qualification the best thing Ernest Douglas Whitmore saw in any given week. "Ernest," she said. It came out loud and clear and entirely unself-conscious, and several of the children around her turned to look, because she had said it with such force, such complete ownership of his name, that it seemed important. She ran to him. She ran in the heedless, full-speed way of 6-year-olds who have not yet learned to moderate their physical expression of emotion, and he bent to catch her, her backpack swinging wide, her arms going around his neck. He held her for a moment. He held her, and he was aware in the back of his chest of the long shadow of the afternoon of the shelter wall and the fluorescent vest and the grip on his arm. He held her, and he let all of it be present without letting it enter this moment, this specific meeting of a grandfather and a granddaughter at a school door at 3:15 on a February Wednesday. Then Marcus appeared at the door of his classroom building across the courtyard. He was 9. He had his backpack over one shoulder, which he had recently decided was more appropriate than 2 shoulders, a decision that Ernest had opinions about and had kept to himself. Marcus looked across the courtyard and saw his grandfather, and for one unguarded second before the 9-year-old composure reasserted itself, his face did exactly what Zoe's face had done. It opened. Then he walked across the courtyard at a measured pace, not running because he was 9, but not slow either. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, because with Marcus, it was Grandpa, not Ernest, which was its own right answer. "Hey, Marcus," Ernest said. Zoe had not let go of his neck. He straightened with her still attached, which was not something he would have done without wincing 5 years ago, but which today, in this moment, he did without thought. He walked them home. Zoe held one hand. Marcus walked beside him with the careful almost contact of a boy who has not yet decided how much contact he will admit to needing. The afternoon was cold, but the cold was the ordinary kind, the kind that has no agenda, that simply exists in February and asks nothing of you. Ernest's grandchildren never knew what had happened on the platform. He did not tell them. He told no one in the family that day, not Renae when she came home, not on the phone to his sister in Baltimore. He cooked dinner. He helped Marcus with a math worksheet. He listened to Zoe's extended report on a conflict she was having with a girl named Priya, which was clearly a significant diplomatic situation requiring serious engagement, and he gave it serious engagement. He sat on the couch after dinner with a child pressed against each arm, the television on and no one really watching it, and he sat in the ordinary accumulated warmth of that, in the plain, ordinary weight of being where he was supposed to be. This is what 38 years of postal service had given him, beyond the pension and the plaque and the co-workers who cried when he left. It had given him a knowledge of what it meant to show up. To show up not when it was easy or convenient or when the weather was cooperative, but because someone was counting on it, because the letter needed to be delivered, because the route existed and he had agreed to walk it. That was the covenant. That was what a route meant. And the Wednesday train was his route now, and Renae was counting on him, and Marcus and Zoe were counting on him, and he had never once given them reason to doubt the count. He was there. He was always there. He had been there for 11 years, and he would be there for as many Wednesdays as he had left, as many school bells at 3:15, as many redcoats and 2 braids running across a courtyard, and a 9-year-old with his backpack on one shoulder trying to look like he doesn't care, which is the most perfect evidence of caring that the world produces. This is what the train carried. This is what Maurice Aiken had understood when he opened his door and stepped out onto the platform. This is what Ernest Douglas Whitmore had been standing up for when he stood against the wall and refused quietly and entirely to be made smaller. There is a version of this story that ends with the reprimand and the commendation and the letter and the newspaper photograph with the procedural satisfaction of a system that noticed it had failed and took steps to do better. That version is real and it matters. But the version of this story that is most real, most essential, most durable against the passage of time, is a man in a charcoal coat arriving at a school door at 3:15. His granddaughter's face opening across the courtyard. His name in her mouth, said with the full force of her love and her certainty, "Ernest." As if she owns the word, as if the word belongs to her, belongs to, he is there. He has always been there. He will always be there for as many Wednesdays as the world allows, for as many school bells at 3:15, for every red coat running across a courtyard in the February cold. This is what it means to keep your word. This is what it means to stand at the yellow line and refuse to step back. This is what it means for another person to see you clearly enough to get off the train. The commendation for Maurice Aiken was framed and hung in the Transit Authority's Operations Center downtown. Ernest did not see it in person, but Renae found the photograph of it in the newspaper and printed it and put it on the refrigerator. It stayed there for years. Every Wednesday, Ernest walked past it on his way to the door. He never mentioned it. He knew what it was. This channel tells the stories of the people who stopped the train and the people who were always worth stopping it for. End.